The philosopher Michel Foucault has said, if power were never anything but repressive, if it never did anything but to say no, do you really think one would be brought to obey it? What makes power hold good? What makes it accepted is simply the fact that it doesn't only weigh on us as a force that says no, but that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms knowledge, produces discourse. It needs to be considered as a productive network which runs through the whole social body much more than a negative instance whose function is repression. Now, I think the important thing in this quote is the idea of power as a productive network, rather than a negative instance of repressive function. But it's an interesting question. We begin with the idea as to whether or not power is merely an instance of prevention, as Foucault says, saying no, of repression. And when we analyze it from this angle, we find out that power is not merely a position of repression, of simply saying no, but that power has a psychological mechanism attached to it. Now, so far from this being an aspect of despair in relation to power, this reality, this dynamic of power, is actually a semblance of hope. It provides us with functions of power that have the capacity to subvert the mere primitive domain of repressive power. This is crucial because it means that if power is not merely a matter of preventing, of prohibiting, of violencing, of repressing, but that it has a psychological element to it, then it means that there is hope for discourse to overcome productive networks of power. That it's possible for psychology, for reason to penetrate into and subvert these networks of power. This is not a pessimistic conclusion, but a conclusion that offers us hope. That power is not merely something that confines us to being subject to might makes right, that the notion of might makes right is not broad enough, that might makes right is not a philosophical understanding that covers the actual function of the attribute of power. That power has a psychological, a rhetorical, a rational, a narrative function to it. And so what's very important in relation to power structures, to networks of power, is to understand how those networks are brought about at the fundamental level, at the axiomatic level, to understand the axioms to which that network refers back to. Now, it may be possible that the network that power refers back to is in fact a matter of might makes right, of repression. And the reason that this may in fact be the case is because it's always possible to lay down a rational idealism which is infused with intelligence and yet have that idealism crushed by barbarity, to have that idealism repressed by barbaric violence. It doesn't mean that this barbarism has in fact transcended the dynamic of intelligent power. It simply means it has crushed it, very possibly unto its own social demise. Because if human life is going to conduct itself on this planet that's floating in the blackness of a void of hostility, then human life has great need of intelligence to progress itself along within existence. If human impulse rejects this intelligence, opting in favor of violence because it is what appeases the impulse, then this impulse could lead the species down a path of disintegration toward the quality of its own existential being. What is crucial in relation to power is not only to understand the axiomatic ground upon which power networks are built, but to understand the psychological dynamics within these structures so that rationality, pragmatic communication, civility structures can penetrate into these power networks and influence them, to alter them, to shift the fulcrum of power within the direction of freedom. This is crucial, but it doesn't do any good to begin in an idealism and to project that idealism onto reality and to think that that idealism automatically is infused with power because it's rational. The idealism is not automatically going to be infused with power unless it is able to function within the dynamics of power. More specifically, within the psychological, communicative, social dynamics of power. The narrative must be able to capture human psychology so that it impacts human behavior at the level of social function. Religion has indeed facilitated this process within the history of the species, but we are not confined to religious narratives simply because religious narratives have functioned this way. It's not only religious narratives that have functioned this way. Power dynamics and power structures are not merely religious, they're psychological. And so again, there's a great deal of hope in learning that power is not merely a repressive form. If power was merely a repressive form, merely a matter of might makes right, as opposed to the idealism which is believed, which is adopted in human activity, and then human activity proceeds to enshrine or defend those beliefs through an act of power, this is the ground of power. And so it's possible to shift power structures by controlling the dynamics of belief, the psychological dynamics of belief. And where does this bring us? To what becomes the crucial domain within the public sphere? Communication becomes the crucial domain. Persuasion becomes the crucial domain. And why does it become the crucial domain? Because the activity of power needs to align itself with higher ideals. A shift emerges in society or culture when the ideals of culture emancipate themselves into higher, more intelligent ideals that lead in the direction of individual emancipation and therefore social emancipation. A society that is founded upon the function of slavery gains progress for individuals and for the function of society, for the development of the species, when that society is emancipated from the unintelligibility of slavery. Why is this the case? Because it's a lie that the individuals who are forced into slavery are automatically lacking in intelligence, are automatically lacking in creativity. The idea is to free up the productive and creative powers of the species, the project of humanism. When this is done, the species has the capacity to progress into higher levels of intelligence, into higher levels of progress, because essentially what has happened is the species has multiplied its probability of flourishing. When slavery has been transcended, then those who would have been slaves now become scientists, now become doctors, now become psychologists. They now enter into society in a very different form, in a form that has the capacity to transform society. This is why it's crucial that intelligence guides the species into higher value structures, higher emancipation structures. This is why species consciousness is important. For our purposes, what is crucial is that we understand the dynamics of power networks in such a way that we can encroach into those networks and affect social change. Social change that moves in the direction of emancipation, which is ultimately good for the progress of the species, which is ultimately good for the experience of the quality of life.